Everyone. I want to talk a little bit about the reading that I've given you for this week by David Welchman Gegeo and Karen Ann Watson Gegeo, called How We Know, Quara a Rural Villagers Doing Indigenous Epistemology. And so I want to kind of lead off just with some more general comments before we get into that essay itself. One of them, this is a very different reading, obviously, than the others that you've been reading this week. Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine are ancient Greek figures. They're kind of pillars of the Western canon of philosophy. And here we have a much more modern, much more recent work, and directed at non-Western cultures, working with non-Western cultures. So why am I giving you this? It seems that it doesn't quite fit with the others. I think it does, and here's why I think it does. If our central concepts of the course are, basically epistemology, ethics, and social theory or social organization, I think it would be a mistake to get too to assume that what's happened in the West is the only thing that can or could happen in the world. I am a believer in broadening the scope of philosophy, and I'm by no means the only one doing that these days. And so one way I think we can do that is, when we're talking about some of these core concepts, and we do need to, think about, the traditional Western canon, we also, I think, need to stretch it and critique it and think beyond it and all of those sorts of things to whatever extent we can. And so there are a lot of ways we can do that. In the first 4 weeks, I've got, some fairly canonical figures, but then I've also got at least one reading in each that tries to raise questions alongside of those, to maybe critique some of the things that come up there. The major book that we're doing in this course by Lorraine Code is a book that really comes from the point of view of feminism and environmental thought and so forth. And so I think there's, I think there are ways of putting Western philosophy in conversation with a lot of other things that I think are equally interesting and equally valid when it comes to philosophy. So, in the essay that we have here, I think it raises some really interesting questions about the relationship between these core areas of epistemology, ethics, and social organization. And clearly from the title, you can see that the focus is on epistemology here. The ethics part is a little bit in the background, but I think it does come out, and we're going to talk a bit about how that actually works. The Western idea about epistemology has been a fairly universalist one, one in which, the methods of epistemology have been honed through, centuries of texts and argumentation and so forth. And what has happened is that epistemology has become for many in the West, a practice of greater and greater abstraction, greater and greater notion of objectivity. So we stand back from the objects of knowledge, and knowledge therefore becomes a kind of public or universal sort of thing. There's been a lot of pushback against that over, I would say, at least 100 odd years, and feminism has often been at the forefront of that, to say, no, there is a form of knowledge that's much more personal, much more attached to the knower, rather than objective, and that's a valid form of knowledge as well. And we need to understand how that works and how that relates to other forms of knowledge. So feminism, I think, has been a driving force in all of this, but so has what we might think of as cultural philosophy. And so what we have here is an example, and it's an example outside of my own area of work. Some of you may know, and it's going to come up in this course, that I do a lot of work in African philosophy. Some of the other readings we have are from African philosophy. This is not. This is from, the Pacific area. This is from, philosophies of indigenous people on the islands in the Pacific, and so there are some similarities to what I recognize in various African groups, but also some differences as well. What's interesting here is that, when philosophy kind of started distinguishing itself from other kinds of academic pursuits in the university. It started drawing lines of demarcation between ways that we can think about knowledge. So, for example, the questions of knowledge are questions within psychology, for example. And the way psychology approaches questions of knowledge is through questions of cognition. How is it that we come to know? How is it that we generate knowledge? Anthropology is interested in knowledge as well. And when anthropology gets a hold of it, it's knowledge that exists within traditional communities or within whatever communities. They don't have to be traditional for anthropology to analyze them. But they are really, rooted within a set of assumptions that a culture holds for itself. In other words, philosophy has had the history of kind of demarcating itself from those kinds of inquiries into knowledge, right? Those are all fine and good, but philosophy says to itself, when we think about knowledge, it's universal, it's it's normative in some sense. In other words, we think about, not just what knowledge somebody does hold, but what kind of knowledge they ought to hold, right? What constitutes reliable knowledge? And so philosophers think a lot about, how do we justify our practices of knowledge so that what we know is truly knowledge? I mean, that goes all the way back to Socrates, and Plato. Socrates is interested in what is, the tie between what we know and what is real, right? What we know and what is true. So some of what we read in this article feels to a kind of very traditional philosopher as if it's not really philosophy, as if it's anthropology or something like that. I think we need to resist that kind of line of demarcation in philosophy. I think we need to see philosophy as being available in a lot of different practices. Sometimes in the West we think about knowledge as being this rarefied and abstracted sort of thing, but I think that's kind of a little bit self-congratulatory for us. I think, in fact, it is much more rooted, it is much more traditional in some cases, it is much more, connected to practices of meaning and all of those sorts of things than we would like to think it is. It's not the kind of abstract thing floating in the, in the heavens or something like that. So we are not as far from, these questions of the rootedness of knowledge within cultural practice as I think some philosophers, at least traditionally, have liked to believe. So what do we see in this, article by Gegeo and Watson-Gegeo? Well, I think we see a really interesting approach to knowledge here that is, they kind of make some connections to some things that we would recognize or we might recognize within Western, especially feminist thought. So they mentioned, for example, standpoint epistemology. What's standpoint epistemology? Well, it is the idea that not every standpoint that produces knowledge is equally valid or equally effective, okay? We need to take into account the positionality and the context of a knower. Furthermore, it's actually more than that. We need to also understand the kind of power structures at work, right? So standpoint epistemology, I think of at least as having debts to forms of Marxism, right? And so in Marxism, you have this idea that, in the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the bourgeoisie is trying to construct forms of knowledge about itself and about how it got its own privilege, how it got its own place in the world, and those are essentially what Marx calls ideology, right? In other words, ideas that are floating in the sky that don't really have any basis in reality. It's the proletariat who truly know, who truly understand how the world is working, because they're the ones connected to the real place that knowledge comes from, which is the material structures of the world. So they not only know where knowledge comes from, they can see the kind of lies, the kind of stories that the bourgeoisie is telling itself. And so that's an early version, I think, of standpoint epistemology. And so feminists get a hold of that. And some feminists say, well, look, the same thing is happening in women's forms of knowing. They understand the patriarchal structures of society. They understand how the stories that patriarchy tells itself about who is justified in having power, who is justified in everything, and how society is structured so that women are secondary citizens. They see all of that. And so they see both the kind of knowledge that comes from women's ways of knowing, as well as the kinds of ideological positions that sustain a kind of patriarchal system. We could see the similar kind of thing happening, for example, in questions around race as well. Blacks, African Americans, and Africans may well see the structures of colonialism, or the structures that are the result of slavery, the structures that are a result of white supremacy, and they may see the stories that they tell themselves in order to justify their own position, and they also can see, the problems with it and a different kind of knowledge. So those are various versions of standpoint, right? So it's more than just taking a position into account. It's taking a position that has a way of understanding that's greater than those that actually have the power. Okay, so that's echoing in this essay as well. When I see the word standpoint used, that's what I hear, and I think it's a legitimate thing to raise. Frankly, I mean, I think the notion in this case that knowledge is tied to a community, tied to local circumstances, and it's a superior kind of knowledge to knowledge that somebody from the outside might come in and just look at what's going on and say, here's what I think's going on. I think that's a pretty strong case that they're trying to make here. There's something else echoing in the background of this, and it's an anthropological distinction between what is sometimes called emic and etic kind of positions. Okay, so the difference between emic and etic is an emic position is an account that comes from the inside of a culture, and an etic position is an account that comes from the outside of the culture. Okay. And so we might intuitively think that the emic is always better, right? It's always better to be inside of a culture and expressing what's going on. And in many cases it is. It's worth noting that the etic also has its value, right? I mean, it's possible to be too close to, a set of cultural practices to see what's going on. And so in anthropology, certainly in mid-20th century anthropology, there would be kind of discussions around functionalism, in which, people would try and describe why cultures are the way they are and why they sustain themselves over the years. And so they might point to things like why people get married. And so from an emic position, somebody might say, well, I'm getting married because this is a valued thing in my culture and I love this person and so forth. From an etic position, one might say, well, the reason that the institution of marriage exists in the culture is because it's a stabilizing influence. It has a lot of other things that accrue to it. It allows people to predict a kind of set of relations, structure kinship relations, all sorts of things like that. It has all sorts of stabilizing features. And so from an etic position, we can look at something from the outside and say, well, we can understand why something is the way it is, and it's quite a different kind of explanation than somebody inside a culture saying, here's why marriage is a good thing. Okay. So having said all of that, the authors of this essay are clearly leaning towards the emic account, and I think for good reason. I think part of it is a kind of pushback against colonialist, versions of epistemology, which have often come into traditional communities and said, we can tell you, about yourself. We can tell you what your problems are. We can tell you what the solutions to your problems are. We can tell you all of these things. I mean, I'm feeling a little bit of pushback against that, and understandably so, right? I mean, if I was part of one of these communities and had somebody from the outside coming in and saying those sorts of things, I'd want to push back too, okay? So what the authors of this paper are doing, I think, is giving us a really interesting kind of quite disciplined sort of insight into how you can actually access and get at the production of knowledge and the forms of knowledge and how knowledge is justified within this particular cultural group. Just a couple of other things I want to mention, and then I look forward to how you, what you might have to say about this in the discussion area. the authors appeal to some Western authors here, and I think they make some interesting kind of comments and connections. They mention what we now call 4E cognition, right? So that's a kind of cognitive science that you see early in Lakoff and Johnson, who they mention in this article here, but it's a move away from what we call computationalist cognition. So what that means is, it's a form, it's the picture of knowledge that we have in our minds. That's basically that our minds hold, they're like computers, and they hold concepts. They develop those concepts. They justify them in terms of how they're related to external reality. So do they, a true concept is one that matches up with reality. And so knowing something means calculating things like that in our brain computers, and that's the kind of dominant story about cognition that's been there really for decades. And there's another version of cognition that's come along that well, there's actually a bunch of other versions of cognition, but one of them we call 4E cognition. And so the 4 E's are the idea that cognition is embodied. In other words, it's not just floating around up here in our brains, but we know with our bodies. We don't just know with our brains. It's enactive. So in other words, it's not just that we have ideas first and then those ideas come forth in the actions that we engage in. It's actually a two-way street. So sometimes we know because we know after we act, not before. Right? We do something, and then our conceptual apparatus starts forming itself. We can see this, for example, in skill acquisition or expertise or things like that. So that's inactive. It's extended. So, for example, we all have these things now, right? So my brain is extended into this thing. This is my memory aid. This is my notepad. This is my, all sorts of different things. And so we extend our cognition into the world around us. We do it in a whole bunch of different ways. This is just in some ways, the most obvious way. But it's not, and again, it's not just that our thinking is whatever happens up here. It goes out into the world. Sometimes it's in terms of the organizations of the world that we have. There are a lot of different things like that. And then it's embedded. And so what that means is that it's socially embedded. It's part of, the interchange of the world. So it's not just that I have a concept up here in my mind. It's that, I come to know my concepts in the act of communicating with others, in the act of conversation, in the act of trying things out on others and having my ideas stated back to me in other words, so that I come to realize them even better than I could articulate them myself. And so this is a kind of a different approach to cognition, and it matches up much more closely with what these authors are talking about, and they admit as much, right? They, in talking about Lakoff and Johnson, and people like that, this paper was written in 2002, I think, 2001. A lot has happened in the last 20 years in this area. And so what we have here is a picture of knowing in the world, and therefore of epistemology that is very different from that kind of standard or classic Western notion that knowledge is about a correspondence theory of truth. We have concepts up here and there's a world out there, and they're supposed to somehow match up with each other. So they talk about oral tradition and how that matters. That fits into that notion of embeddedness, right? The ancestors, are part of your community still. The stories that are told are part of the extension of knowledge into the community, right? So it's not just something that's held inside here. It's knowledge is distributed around the community. It's dynamic, right? Sometimes we think of traditional communities as being fairly static, caught in amber in some sense, and that really doesn't represent most traditional communities. They are dynamic. They change over time. They deal with threats, opportunities. They deal with interactions with other cultures. They deal with all sorts of different kinds of things. And so there is a set of mechanisms for doing that. So What about ethics in all of this, right? We've talked really about epistemology and forms of knowing, and we've talked a little bit about social organization as well. It seems to me there are, question or issues about ethics connected to all of this. Some of it is connected to the specific terms that they're using here. I mean, when they start their investigation of culture within this paper, they really are investigating concepts that have a kind of ethical side to them. How should we live together? What constitutes reliable knowledge and what doesn't, and what are the implications of that? So ethics really is not the question of here is a ethical problem now, what are you going to do? Right? I mean, it's not that kind of abstracted sort of thing where you're presented with something and now you have to come up with a theory that you can apply to it. The ethics is really, in some ways, then there's some echoes of Aristotle here, although it's not direct, obviously, because it's very different traditions. But, there is a sense of what virtue looks like. And virtue is embedded in a community. And virtue is about moderation. What does it mean to live well within that community? To find your place, to know your place. So I think there is a certain kind of underlying sensibility of ethics to all of this, and it really represents a different kind of approach to ethics than a lot of the stuff that we might see within some of the Western conversation. So in what ways does this push back, if at all, to the figures that we've looked at this week, Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine? Well, I think in some ways the most obvious pushback is against Augustine. This is an embeddedness of knowledge that does not presume that we are fallen, that does not presume that our job is to deny sensation and to deny, the material world in order to find the mind of God, right? I mean, exactly the opposite. I mean, this paper is full of discussion about how we attend to our senses, how we attend to how we are engaged in the world around us. And so, Augustine, is giving us a different notion of knowledge entirely than what we see here. To some extent, to the extent that Augustine is drawing on Plato, we could probably implicate Plato on some of that as well, right? I mean, for Plato too, there is a sense that true knowledge is figuring out the forms, and where do the forms live? They live outside of the material world. This is a discussion of epistemology and social organization that's very much in this world, in the material world. And so, I think there is a pretty strong pushback to some of the figures that we're seeing this week. If they come closest to anyone, it probably would be Aristotle, because there is a sense that we live in a real material world and we have to negotiate that. So those are just a few of the thoughts on this. I'd be really interested in what you have to say about it in the discussion area. So have at it.